Hello and welcome back to Hide and Speak. I'm Chris, and if you've been with us for a while, you know we keep coming back to one nagging question. Who's watching and what do they actually do with it? Tonight we're putting a face on the people inside the machine. Our guest used to be one of them. Mike German spent 16 years as an FBI agent inside white supremacist groups and militia cells, living a fake life for months at a time. The kind of work where you can't tell your own family what you did that day. Then in 2002, he found his own colleagues mishandling a terrorism investigation and falsifying records to cover it up, and he reported it, knowing exactly what it would cost him. 4 years later, the inspector general said he'd been right the whole time. So when Mike German tells you that nearly 80 fusion centers have sat there for more than 20 years without stopping a single terrorist attack, that's not a theory. That's a man who went looking for the threats himself and came back to tell you where the surveillance state is actually pointed. And it's not always at the bad guys. Nathan's here too. Nathan, I know you've been waiting for this one. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good today. The weather is great here for the first time this year, so I'm happy about that. I always say I'm super excited for this show, but this one is definitely special. The story that we're going to hear today is just fascinating, and I think it's just I'm honored to be here and participate in this.
Absolutely, me too. I'm really excited for this one. Our guest today, Mike German, as I said, is former FBI special agent, a whistleblower. He was a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice and has been researching and writing books and papers on fusion centers, policing, and hate groups for the last 2 decades. Mike, thank you so much for joining Hide and Speak. It is truly an honor.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks very much. And I appreciate your effort to bring more attention to the intelligence fusion centers. It was almost 20 years ago that I wrote my first report warning about them. So unfortunately, it hasn't really gotten the attention of policymakers to realize how dangerous these are.
You know, you're absolutely right. Like, it blows my mind. You know, we look at all the different privacy threats, and this one is just like, to me, is probably one of the scariest things that's going on. And for some reason, it's also the one that seems to be least known. Like, people don't really understand what's going on here. And it's not that the information is there. Like you said, 20 years ago, you put this out there, and for some reason, people aren't paying attention. So we're hoping we can get some more people to pay attention to it, because it's definitely an important topic. So we're just a reminder that the opinions expressed by members of our panel are their own personal opinions and do not necessarily reflect the views of Hide and Speak, vp.net, or bmail. But we do want to take a minute to thank vp.net and bmail, which make Hide and Speak possible. If you want to support the show, the best way to do that is to sign up for them, which is also a great way to protect your privacy online. We have a quick video to watch, and then we're digging it. Imagine you want to contact your friend. You got to send them something in the mail, the normal snail mail, if anybody still uses that. So one option, which is like regular email, is just a postcard. So you send that, and anybody who sees this thing along the way, they know who you are. They know who the person who's receiving it is. They know what day and time you sent it, or we still it was post stamp. They know your address, and they know the content of the message, and they know the person's address. So they got everything. They got all the information they could possibly want. So the next option would be like some of these other encrypted email providers that don't encrypt the metadata, like Proton, for example. That's sort of like having a postcard where the message is invisible. Maybe that's in a secret code, so nobody along the way can see the message, but they can still see the sender, they still see the receiver, they see which city it was sent from, they see your address, they see the receiver's address. More than enough information in a lot of cases to figure out what's going on right there. And again, like the subject line, that's like on the, the front of it says like, greetings from Hawaii. It's like, okay, well, now this person's in Hawaii now. And that's kind of like having the subject line visible. So then B-mail is like, you take a letter and you put it inside a safe and you seal that safe with a digital code and you ship the safe to the person, and he is the only other person in the entire world that knows what that code is. That's how B-mail is. So anybody along the way, good luck. Like, you're not getting inside. This is a safe. That's kind of how B-mail works. It's basically a vault, and the only people who have the code are you and the person that you're sending it to. All right, let's just dig right into it here. So, Mike, you spent months undercover inside white supremacist groups and right-wing militia cells. What is the moment in that work where you remember thinking, I can't tell my wife about this when I get home tonight?
Actually, before it even starts. It's funny because obviously I've written a couple of books. I've talked somewhat about those cases and the work that I did. But there's still a lot I won't talk about about how an FBI undercover operation gets set up. The nuts and bolts behind building a false identity and how to protect that identity. mostly because it's exceedingly boring. It's not something that sounds very interesting, but it's essential when you're out there doing this work that there are some protections if somebody starts trying to check who you are. So I try not to talk about any of that kind of nuts and bolts of the operations, and that's something that I try to protect, even as a privacy advocate. And of course, none of those issues have a direct effect on people's privacy or civil liberties, or I would raise those as I have other civil liberties abuses.
I believe that. When you were inside, was there ever a person you genuinely liked despite everything they believed? Like, how do you hold those two things at once?
So it's an interesting question. And, there were a lot of law enforcement people I worked with who would take things personally, who would really generate hate for the people that they were investigating, and even for the lawyers who defended them in court. But I never really saw it that way. And, starting out an operation, I know I'm going to be spending a lot of time with these people. And, typically you look at the files that the FBI has, and it's all derogatory information. So it's hard to look at that and say, how am I going to find some personal connection to this person to be able to work alongside them? But, what I would remind myself is everybody has a mother who loves them. And my job is to find out what my mother or what their mother finds appealing about these people. And, what I found is that every person, both the subjects we were investigating and in law enforcement, have aspects of their personality that are positive and helpful, and aspects that aren't and are disliked, or that you can dislike very strongly. So I would just focus on what about them I liked. And sure, there were plenty of them that I wouldn't mind having a beer with. But they were doing bad things. They were breaking the law, and they were putting a lot of people at risk in their, as part of their direct choices that they were making. And my job was to gather the evidence to hold them responsible for those choices.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's got to be hard though. It's just it's a hard line to follow for sure.
Perspective.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly it was a difficult to list, and especially early on in the investigations. I'd grown up sometime in the South. I grew up in the military. My dad was an Army officer, so racism wasn't something that was unfamiliar to me. I understood how it worked, but I didn't realize the complexity of the philosophies and theologies and ideologies that were involved. And often I would hear something and it was hard to tell whether it was a joke. It was so horrible that it's like, okay, are we kidding around here? Or is this something that you seriously believe? So, but fortunately they were very apt educators, and they sent me materials to read, and it allowed me to sort of catch up with their mindset and a lot of details. In fact, a lot of American history that isn't taught in public high schools, about how foundational white supremacist ideologies and theologies were to creating the United States and to establishing chattel slavery, to the genocide of Native Americans, to all through establishing Jim Crow, resisting the civil rights movement. To this day, I still see those threads that go back to that history that was suppressed for a while, but was never really dismantled. And they have been able to bring it back to the mainstream in a way that I would have found hard to believe in the 1990s when I was undercover with these groups.
Yeah, the last 20 years or so, things have really changed a lot. The temperature is really heating up.
Yeah, and I would argue have changed back. Right, it's not it's not something that's original. This is something that's been a major part of our society for for the entire existence of the
Absolutely.
American experiment.
No, absolutely. A lot of the darkest times of our history all seem to come back to that same thread.
Yeah.
You co-wrote the screenplay for Imperium, the Daniel Radcliffe movie about an FBI agent undercover with white supremacists. What did Hollywood get right about that work, and what do you have to fight to keep accurate?
So there was a lot right. Dan Ragosas, who co-wrote the screenplay with me and directed the film, originally came to me having read my first book, Thinking Like a Terrorist, and wanting to do a life story of me, wanting to get my life rights and do that. And I wasn't interested in that. And he came back and came back and came back over a course of several months and even years, I think. And finally, I agreed to help him write a fictional screenplay about a fictional FBI agent in similar situations, and tried to make it realistic and address some of the complexity of the white supremacist movement. It's often when it's discussed in the media, it's this one thing, this one belief, where really there are a lot of different groups with different ideologies and philosophies and theologies. And one of the mistakes that I see in a lot of other films that tackle neo-Nazis and white supremacy is they tend to present these people as almost supermen, and so I wanted to make sure that their buffoonery was obvious, that, sure, they were dangerous, sure, they were involved in real things, but they aren't appealing in any way. There's no, I'd hope nobody would look at that film and say, oh, I want to be like that guy, other than the FBI agents, of course, depicted in the film.
Yeah, they did a really good job with that. But at the same time, there was this interesting dynamic. So, like, a lot of films go too far in that direction too, and show that like every white supremacist is a complete moron, which then kind of makes people think, oh, we don't have to really worry about them. They're too dumb to actually do anything, which is not the case. And like,
Right.
They focused in on, here's this like academic man who is, by all intents and purposes, seemed very, very intelligent, well-read, and, was very good at inspiring other people to follow his ideology. And it was like, that's actually what's out there too. And like, that guy was the real threat that people weren't, worried about, because you look at the other guys that are violent and they're fighting and they have the guns and everything. You're like, that's the guy you got to watch. And like,
right,
it's not always the case. So I like that they had that different dynamic.
And people don't seem to realize that these people were always, they tend to talk about white supremacy as a form of extremism, but it's much more mainstream than that. It's not something on the fringe of our society. It's something more foundational to our society. And it's not just the skinheads, which are in the film, but people who work in an office every day, maybe sitting in the cubicle next to you or in the office next to you. And one of the advantages we have now, although we have to suffer through it, is that the mask is off. That this has always been members of state legislators and state legislatures and city councils, members of Congress, people in federal agencies. This has always been there. It's just been muted since the civil rights movement, which is a relatively short time in the history of the United States. And now that they feel they can talk about these beliefs openly, you see how prevalent it is and how powerful it is, that it's not just fringe people on the extreme edges of our society. It's people with real power.
That's a really good point. I've never thought about that before, but the word extremist or extremism in itself sort of minimizes the whole movement, because it's like you say, it sounds like there's just a couple of wackos over in the corner that aren't a real concern. But yeah, I never really thought about that. But yeah, that's a very good point. That word itself kind of minimizes things. Yeah. Let's see. Was there ever a moment when you were undercover and you thought your cover was blown?
Every day. Undercover agents had a saying, there's no normal reaction to an abnormal situation. And you were always constantly on alert, while pretending not to be, which was really the trick. That, my personality is pretty laid back. and having to have my heart rate going at 150 all the time while just hanging out and, you know, drinking a beer. That was really the tricky part, was learning how to appear relaxed in a situation where, you know, and a lot of times I wasn't so much worried that they would figure out I was an FBI agent, or identify the FBI surveillance team that was following us, or identify an informant who had been working with us. I was less concerned about that than just getting killed accidentally. You know, they were, you know, I had come up through the military and the FBI training, and, you know, firearms safety is built into my being. And the way that a lot of these guys handled weapons was exceedingly dangerous. And particularly when they started manufacturing explosive devices, you know, so that was really more fear-inducing. And there's also a lot, which is also something that the mainstream media and terrorism analysts don't really recognize, is how much intra-group violence there is. You know, these are violent people who realize they are breaking the law and therefore subject to investigation, and are constantly worried about informants and FBI agents infiltrating. And it creates a culture of challenging people. And most people in a criminal environment don't like being called an informant, and it can cause a lot of intra-group violence. And a lot of it's not because they really believe somebody's an informant. It's just that person is a step higher on the hierarchy than they are. So if they can pull them down for a bit of time and elevate themselves as the person who identified the informant, they'll do that sort of internal political struggle, you know, when it's baseless. So, you know, the first time somebody straight out called me an informant, I was pretty freaked out. But when I realized they called a different person an informant every day, it sort of served ironically as a protection, that everybody was always calling everybody an informant. So it wasn't really that debilitating when somebody pointed out something you did was unusual for their environment. Yeah,
that makes sense. Like the ultra paranoid environment, so it's kind of easy to blend in when everybody's getting picked out.
Right. Yeah. And I've never really thought of it that way either, because it's like the more dangerous thing was just hanging out with these people.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And what their daily lives are like, right? So it's not just like them discovering you; it's you having to participate in their, you know, violent nature.
Right. Yeah. They're, you know, and particularly that they're armed regularly, if not always, and, you know, constantly worried about, you know, being pulled over. Driving around in a car with them was always frightening, because, you know, if a police officer pulled them over, they're not looking at it, oh, I must have been speeding, or I must have, you know, rolled through a stop. They're looking at it, this is part of the revolution, and I'm about to be put into a prisoner of war camp. You know, that's how they view that situation. So, you know, that kind of uncontrollable environment was what was really hard to participate in for as long as I did.
Yeah, I can't imagine the anxiety to have all day, every day in that job. Kudos to you. I don't think I can handle that, honestly. That's a lot. Well, the next thing here, we got blowing the whistle. This is a very important chapter here. 2002, you found out colleagues were running an illegal wiretap and altering records on a counterterrorism case in Florida. Walk us through the moment you decided you were going to report it, knowing what reporting it would probably cost you.
Really, it was upon discovery of and what it was an informant had recorded a meeting, but left the meeting and leaving the recorder in the meeting. So the conversation that was captured was illegally recorded, and that sometimes happens by accident or through poorly training your informant on what the rules are around recording. So it was really this one illegal recording. The only problem was it was the basis of the entire investigation. So it was, when it's accidental, there's a method of creating, having a unrelated prosecutor come in and put guardrails around that conversation so that the agents continuing the investigation don't listen to it. And so they can't use that information, and you sort of wall off the illegal conversation. But so initially when I raised that, oh, I found out this happened, I expected that sort of mitigation to take place, but instead they refused and said they were going to pretend it wasn't recorded, even though it had already been transcribed. Agents had read it. It wasn't something that could, and I was very good at pretending as an FBI undercover agent, but I wasn't really going to pretend when I was testifying on the stand and pretend something that wasn't true and perjure myself. So I assumed I just need to raise this up the chain of command, and eventually it'll hit the right desk where somebody will do something. And it was also the timing. This was after 9/11, when the FBI was supposedly, retooling to be better, more effective at handling terrorism investigations. And Colleen Rowley's complaint about one of the 9/11 investigations had gone public. So there was a broad discussion about whistleblowers and the need to protect whistleblowers. And both the President of the United States, President George W. Bush, and the new director of the FBI at the time, Robert Mueller, came out and said, if there's an agent who knows of a counterterrorism case being mishandled, we want you to report that through the chain of command. So it seemed like, okay, this is going to be the opportunity to really reform what is wrong with the FBI, which is this kind of mismanagement. And instead, the retaliation was swift and much more open than I expected. The FBI is a very bureaucratic organization, and there are 1,000 ways you can hurt somebody's career. Denying them travel, denying them opportunities for training, giving them lesser assignments. There's all kinds of things that could happen that might, impact your career or impact your enjoyment of your career. And so I was sort of on guard for that kind of vague activity, but instead it was very direct. They came right out and said, you're a whistleblower, so you'll never work undercover again. The retaliation was obvious. And at first I was surprised by that, but then I realized that's what made the retaliation effective, right? If they were sneaky about it, then other agents wouldn't know what they were doing to me. So they wanted to make clear, yes,
make an example out of him.
Mike's been a successful undercover agent. He's raising a legitimate concern, but we're going to destroy his career, and we'll destroy yours too if you say something's wrong with the way we're managing our cases. So ironically, the way the FBI's, well, not ironically, intentionally, the way its whistleblower procedures work, it's to identify you and prevent you from giving the information to anybody who might be able to actually take it seriously and do something about it.
Yeah, it's wild, honestly. Like, this is, what you think you're supposed to do. You take an oath to protect the country, and like, that is what you're doing. You know what I mean? And then to have them immediately retaliate is horrifying. But you did eventually get vindicated, but it took like 4 years before the inspector general finally vindicated you?
4 years after I resigned. So I spent 2 years staying in sort of a penalty box phase.
Oh, man.
Where they weren't letting me do work. And I got very good at the New York Times crossword puzzle, and constantly sort of upping the retaliation. And I was still hoping that eventually it would reach somebody's desk who would take it seriously. And I was working with the inspector general. I thought I was. That's a whole nother story. I thought they were on my side. at the time. But it really wasn't until I resigned from the FBI and went to Congress and went public about it. And that's really how the whistleblower system works, is that unless you're willing to go public, and I knew that was the end of my career. I wasn't going to, the retaliation was bad enough when I kept my complaints internal. Once I went to Congress, I knew, this is over. So I resigned right after I went to Congress.
Well, thank you for doing that. That's a massive, massive life-changing decision to make for the good of the people. And we really, really respect that. Federal whistleblower protections look strong on paper, but you've lived through what they actually do in practice. And if I'm not mistaken, doesn't the FBI have like their own special set of whistleblower protections that are a lot weaker than the normal federal protections?
That's right. The FBI is exempt from civil service whistleblower protections, as some other law enforcement and intelligence agencies are. And they've Congress requested that the Justice Department develop procedures that would mimic the protections of the civil service laws. But those protections that the Justice Department put in place were really a trap. And when I went through, if you reported the misconduct through the chain of command, you weren't protected. There were only a few offices. You had to go all the way up to the special agent in charge in your office, or go directly to the inspector general, or directly to the Office of Professional Responsibility. But that's not really how the FBI works. Right? The FBI has a chain of command, and the managers, their role is not to let their boss be surprised by anything that's happening. So if I went and asked for a meeting with the special agent in charge, immediately what would happen is I would get a call from my supervisor, who got a call from the assistant special agent in charge saying, "What is Mike doing? Why does he want to talk to the SAC?" So I had gone through the chain of command. So the FBI was arguing I wasn't protected because I went through the chain of command rather than directly to the SAC, even though the complaint I made through the chain of command was directed to the SAC. I just told my supervisor I'm calling the assistant special agent in charge to let him know, so he can let the SAC know that I'm sending this complaint up. So I tried to operate within the rules and within the system, but it was designed to fail. And that has since been corrected. Senator Grassley has been a champion of government whistleblowers for some time. And he put forward legislation in 2015 that addressed that issue. But it's still very weak, and it's still designed in a way to prevent the public from ever getting the information, so that the institution and the Justice Department can know the information, and perhaps some members of Congress, but nobody's allowed to make it public. Once you make it public, you don't have any protection.
Yeah, that's dirty.
Yeah,
because,
and
a lot of times,
without that public anger about the misconduct, nothing happens.
Exactly.
Right. I had raised it for 2 years internally, and again, working with the inspector general, but nothing was happening. Nobody was doing anything. They were letting the retaliation continue and kept telling me, just be patient, just be patient. But it wasn't until I went to Congress that they actually started doing a legitimate investigation.
Yeah, like you said, set up, designed to fail. Like that.
Right. And then 4 years later, after that is when the report came out confirming that what I reported was accurate.
Yeah, after they've, you lost your job and they messed up your whole life. Like, oh yeah, by the way, you were right. Sorry about that.
And the frustrating thing about it is, they came out and said what I said was accurate, but it's because there was a transcript, right, of the meeting that the FBI said never happened. Right? So it's
so it probably wouldn't have come out otherwise.
Why would it take you 3 years to investigate that, right? They say it didn't happen on paper, filed in FBI files. Mike Sherman's a liar. This meeting never occurred. And here's the transcript of the meeting that never occurred, showing not only that it occurred, but it was recorded.
That's wild. But that's the thing. Like, we've seen this, not just FBI, like every every branch of government at every level. I mean, right down to like HOAs. Like if
Right.
the people don't hold them accountable, nothing ends up happening. So if they
Right.
set up a whistleblower system where the people don't get to know, there's no way to hold anyone accountable.
And the investigations, while I appreciate that the Inspector General ultimately vindicated me in that case, the fact that it took so long, by the time there was any accountability, everybody had been transferred or moved on, and there was really, new rules were in place. So, what really can you do about it? Okay, the FBI gets a little slap on the wrist, but no manager was fired over it. No, the people responsible for both the illegal recording and the retaliation weren't disciplined in any significant way. So, it's just a way. It's a way of suppressing information from the public and delaying the exposure, so that it's hard to generate any true reform that would address the issue or hold anybody responsible.
That seems to be a common theme in government these days.
Yeah,
for sure. Well, let's see. There's a lot of people who go through bureaucratic disappointment and come out really cynical. And then there's people like you who come out fighting. What kept you in the second category?
I don't think it was a choice. There was a lot of people. It's been a long time now since 9/11, and a lot of people weren't active in government. I mean, that's one of the things that scares me about the FBI today is, an FBI career is usually 20 to 25 years. So now there's nobody at the FBI who was in the prior organization, or relatively few, who understood how the post-church committee rules worked, and how paying attention to those rules still allowed you to be a very effective investigator. They're operating under this system that's been in place for so long. I don't know how you go back and reform it's almost like we're back to where J. Edgar Hoover was in charge. And how do you, it took 20 years from the time J. Edgar Hoover was killed to when I came in before you started to see those church committee reforms really starting to take effect. I think it's just a very difficult. I think we're in a difficult place where reforming not just the FBI, but the larger intelligence agencies has become that we have to stop talking about reform and talk about dismantling them and building a system fresh that actually will address both the security issues that I'm still concerned about, but address them in a very narrow and focused way, targeting people who are actually doing harm and not people we don't like because of the way they think or who they associate with, and build up a new system. I'm not sure that this one's salvageable anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just like, cars, like you can keep repairing it, but eventually it gets to the point where they're like, you got to start over. You need to get a new car. Like no
Right.
amount of repair is going to fix this thing. And I think, that we've passed that point a long time ago.
Yeah. And, after 9/11, there was this concept of total information awareness that became very popular in the government, that, they had just realized that with the advancement of computer technology and the adoption in mass society, that there was all this persistent data about everything. And if only the government can get all that data, then they'll know everything. And when this total information awareness was exposed to the public, they were horrified by it. And, it freaked out and said, oh no, we don't want our government having all this data. And unfortunately, again, because it's so opaque, they ended the program Total Information Awareness, but just broke it into pieces. So it became what was then known as the President's Surveillance Programs, and the collection of telephone metadata from the general public, and all these separate programs. but there was constantly an effort to sort of bring them together. Under both Democratic and Republican administrations. During the Obama administration, the National Counterterrorism Center was allowed to start amassing all that data, putting it in a common database. They could swallow any government database that their director said contained terrorism-related information. That's not a very high standard.
No.
And it doesn't they weren't just collecting the information they were claiming was terrorism related, they were ingesting the entire databases. So that became normalized. Unfortunately, I was at the ACLU then, and we pushed back, and a lot of other groups pushed back, but it didn't get the public imagination the way total information awareness did. And so it sort of slid through. And it really took Edward Snowden coming out, Edward Snowden, NSA contractor who released a tremendous amount of information about what the National Security Agency was doing and how it was collecting information, which it was fascinating to me because you had members of Congress who voted for the Patriot Act all of a sudden saying, "Oh, we didn't know it was used that way," where that's actually your job to know how the intelligence agencies are using the authorities you give them.
Exactly.
So there were some minor reforms, but this march toward total information awareness has continued up into this day with the DOGE effort to collect all sorts of data and artificial intelligence data centers ingesting just tremendous amounts of information about average people who aren't suspected of any misconduct or criminal activity, and that's where our civil liberties and privacy are most at risk.
Yes. Well, and you worked at the FBI at a very interesting time. Like you worked there, pre-internet, and then you got to see, how everything changed. Like, was there anything that surprised you for where the agency is now, or was there things that you kind of saw coming, or anything like that for where we are now in this data collection, mass surveillance?
So I was an agent throughout all of Louis Freeh's tenure as director, and he was famously anti-computer. And so the FBI was very behind on its own ability to use the computer and to use computers and to use the internet in conducting investigations. So it wasn't a surprise to me that, after 9/11, some of the other law enforcement and intelligence agencies wanted to send the FBI photographs and evidence and said, how can we transmit this to you? And the answer was, do you have a fax machine? And so, there was a huge effort to ramp up the FBI's computer system, but again, very secretive. And I think the first $700 million invested over several years to build this new system basically failed, and they had to start over again. And I'm not sure it's ever really caught up to where we are. Certainly as an undercover agent, even before 9/11, there were inklings about how the internet was going to impact our ability to make believable covers, undercover identities. And now whenever you're going to meet somebody, you Google them and get as much information as you can before your business meeting or whatever. So you can imagine that for an undercover agent, that's kind of frightening. Although, one of the points that I made is that if you're doing the proper work from the beginning, and I know this is going to sound vague, it's really about being personable in a way that gets people to trust you. That if something doesn't look right, but you're a trustworthy person in their perspective, they're going to find a justification or believe your justification for why that aspect of your activities doesn't really fit the picture you're playing. Where if you're not doing that part appropriately, what I learned undercover was, when somebody's calling you an informant, it's not necessarily because they have any real basis to believe so. It's that they don't like you, and they want you out. So that's why they're doing it. And if you're unlikable, it's hard to get anybody to trust you enough to engage in something that's going to send them to jail if you're not who you're saying you are. So
that makes total sense.
It's certainly a challenge, the internet, but it just requires you to be better and more precise about how you're doing that work.
Yeah, it makes sense. About being personable too. Like when I first saw the movie Imperium, like I'll be honest, like I thought it was weird that Daniel Radcliffe was in it. I was like, Harry Potter as an FBI agent. And honestly, everybody I've told about this movie to, that's the first thing they say. They're like, Harry Potter? And then I watched the movie and realized like he was actually like a perfect choice for it. And like they get it right. And that was his first reaction too. They're like, we want you undercover. He's like, me? He's like, look at me. Like, I'm not the guy. And they're like, what do you think undercover is? You think it's chasing bad guys and getting into gunfights? Like, if you get to that point, you've already lost. Like, it's about talking to people and getting them to like you, and you're good at that. So that's what matters. And, if anything, I think being a small guy is probably beneficial in a white supremacist group where there's, testosterone checkpoints all the time, so
exactly.
It made a lot of sense.
Exactly right. And, I appreciate you saying that, because that was a discussion. At one point they were saying, okay, who would be the FBI agent? We need to find somebody like Matt Damon. And I was like, no. The audience is not going to be afraid for Matt Damon, right? He's Jason Bourne. They're going to expect him to jump out a window and fall 10 flights of stairs and roll his way out of that and have all kinds of tools to fight back with. You have to find somebody of small stature who the audience will say, how is this person going into that dangerous situation? So you get that empathy that, oh, this person is completely vulnerable. Even though they're a law enforcement officer, it's the dark humor of undercover agents. We used to say that the surveillance teams that were following us were not there to save our lives. They were there to avenge our lives, right? They're not going to get in the room if something goes bad fast enough to save you. And, particularly in these groups that are very violent and well armed. A colleague of mine, it was funny because there were every kind of personality with undercover agents, big, strong, muscly guys, slight people, more slight people like me, some, obviously women. And, it was just how you fit in that situation. But what I found is the people in some of the most violent groups were some of the were the least intimidating in appearance and personality. We're not in your face type of personalities. We're not the life of the party kind of personalities. They were, quiet and in the background. But what I always tried to do was say, but you have in building the character, you have to be reliable. One thing law enforcement knows is the sub criminals tend not to be very good about showing up on time. But I always wanted to be there early, and the case agents and, getting the surveillance team, it's a lot of work. So they were like, why are we rushing to get there? They're going to be 30 minutes late. And I would say, my whole job is to make them believe I'm reliable. And, at some point they're going to need somebody who they need to have there on time. And they're going to know Mike's the guy who is always there on time. And so we're going to start trusting him a lot more. And that's absolutely part of how you build that trustworthiness, even though in the end, you're going to betray that trust.
No, that's smart. That's a good one. Just showing up early. That makes sense. If a young agent today came to you with a situation like you faced in 2002, what was the first thing you'd tell them to do?
So in my advocacy career, both at the ACLU and the Brennan Center, I would regularly receive calls from FBI agents who were in a situation. And, unfortunately, my advice had to start out with, are you willing to lose your job over this? because if you're not, that could be an outcome. And, the way the system's set up, it's a likely outcome. And which often got very sharp responses that, hey, I haven't done anything wrong. And I said, I know, neither did I. But, I'm not in the FBI anymore.
Join the club.
So, but, there is a process that I would encourage them to follow, so that that as it's all turning out, at least you can say, I followed the procedures. And there's the Lloyd Lafayette law that says that any federal employee can talk to a member of Congress. So I could facilitate getting them in touch with Congress, so that they could at least explain to their elected representatives. Unfortunately, what I found is often that was less effective than it should have been, because number one, a lot of the members of Congress were not really that interested in taking on the FBI, with a number of exceptions like Senator Grassley and Senator Leahy back in the 90s and early 2000s. So, a lot of them, even though they might want to help and will listen to you and commiserate with you, there's nothing they can do without some public knowledge of this that they can raise. Raising things in a classified environment is the tree falling in the forest when nobody's there. Nobody can hear it.
Well, yeah. Plus, you're going to them saying, "Hey, the FBI is extremely powerful, and they can see everything you do, and they're breaking the law. Do you want to help me take them on?" It's like, no. They
Right.
can see what it's terrifying.
Campaign finance laws are very complicated, and if the FBI has a saying, nobody's administratively pure. Okay, so if I make an enemy of the FBI and they start investigating all of my associates and my campaigns, are they going to be able to find some mistake I made and make me an example? Yeah, it's a legitimate concern. And again, a part of a system that has mobilized in a way that's completely dangerous to our democracy. And that was the subtitle of my book was How the New FBI Damages Democracy, and that's certainly part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's scary for any organization to have that kind of power, and it's usually the FBI is the one looking at the FBI. You know what I mean? It's like
Right.
When oversight is done by the people that are being looked at, you can't expect really much from that.
Right. And the FBI is although they often think of themselves as an independent agency, they are under the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice has some oversight function of the FBI. But, this is a Department of Justice that wrote torture memos, authorizing torture, and, allowed Guantanamo to be created, and, sort of bent our understanding of the rules in dangerous ways right from the very beginning after 9/11. Authorized the warrantless wiretapping program, completely abandoned the principles. And it was frustrating for me as I had come up wanting to be an FBI agent as a young person. So I was very interested in following everything about the FBI. So I knew all about COINTELPRO and the Church Committee and how their reforms were intended to refocus the FBI where there's evidence of wrongdoing, right? That's what they should be investigating. And the rules that were in place, I felt, and especially working undercover in groups that were both dangerous and had vile ideologies, at least, it was hard sometimes to listen to what they were saying, but the rules forced me to have the discipline to say, okay, this person is saying some really scary things, but I can't find evidence he's actually doing anything. Where this person over here is quiet in the corner and not really expressing an interest in these ideas, but he's manufacturing illegal weapons. He's making bombs. He's doing things that are illegal, helping this group that's ideological. I need to put my focus on the guy who's doing things, not the guy who's saying things.
Yeah, no, that makes sense for sure. The words aren't going to blow up anytime soon, but bombs
Right.
certainly can. Absolutely. Oh, let's get into the dirty deeds at the fusion centers here.
Right.
What is something that most people don't know about fusion centers that would generally surprise them?
That we don't know who works there. The creation of this network of fusion centers, and again, 80 of them across the country, 80 plus. We actually don't have a solid number, because not all the centers that are set up are part of the net, are part of our DHS recognized by the Department of Homeland Security. So those don't typically get talked about in the same way. But basically the idea of it, in the federal government came up with, was having this network of centers where it's not just federal, state, and local law enforcement, but also emergency responders, public health, and private companies, all working together, sharing information where it's very unclear who's in charge. So we don't really have we don't have an accurate information about who works in these centers. What private companies have access to this information that is being collected with law enforcement and intelligence authorities, and how is it being used? You know, it's very valuable information, right? And if you have a private company that has a profit motive with access to that very valuable information, what do you think's happening with it? You know, and what rules apply when these entities are all working together in the center? It's completely opaque, and it's the largest domestic terrorism, or I'm sorry, bad choice words, the largest domestic surveillance apparatus ever created in the United States, with virtually no public discussion about it, other than groups like the ACLU, who allowed me to write that report. And then at Brennan Center, I wrote another one almost 15 years later. You know, and efforts by state governments to even find out what's happening there. Your elected representatives can't walk into a state fusion center.
It's insane.
How is that possible? But
sense.
it's very unclear whether it's the feds in charge of this, or is it the state in charge? Is it the local participants? Is it the private companies? We don't know.
Yeah, we did a stream recently about that when we named you Hero of the Week, and we talked about that a lot, that they're specifically set up with these really bizarre structures so that nobody knows who's in charge and nobody knows who's funding what. And it's very difficult to go either after the funding or after who's in charge, because it's all split in every different direction. So
right, and
it really seems intentional.
Yeah, we talked about that earlier just in this episode. Now it's like they intentionally make everything very vague, so then by the time it comes back around and they figure out who to nail to the cross for whatever they've done wrong, that person has already moved on to something else, and they're no longer in that position. So now it's like it's this cat and mouse game of just like, well, they're gone, so I guess we can't do anything about it.
Right. And because it's multi-jurisdictional, they can use the law in a way that defeats the law. So, you know, there's a federal Freedom of Information Act that, you know, journalists and activists use to get information about what federal government agencies are doing. But if you FOIA a fusion center, the federal government will say it's not ours, that's a state entity. But if you use a state law, they push the information back to the federal government and say, oh, those are federal records, those aren't our records. And it's set up in a way to make it very difficult for the public to get any information about it.
It doesn't make sense that can exist, and that private corporations can have a seat inside and have access to this data when, like you said, a Congress member can't walk in there and look at that same data. It's like, it doesn't make any sense, and I don't understand how that's even legal.
and it's not clear if anyone is vetting any of these private entities and private contractors. And we're going to talk about BlueLeaks in a minute, and that's sort of an example of how these unvetted systems create security vulnerabilities. So rather than protecting our security, this network is actually putting our security at greater risk.
Absolutely. Let's see. People hear fusion centers and they picture like a war room full of screens and everything. What do they actually look like inside?
So it was interesting back in the 2006, 2007, when we started doing the research, and we started just cold calling the fusion centers, and every once in a while, some of them would say, "How'd you get this number? We don't exist. Leave us alone." But a few of them did, and and it was interesting because I've talked to other state legislators and activists that have gotten these kinds of tours where they'll walk you through what is basically an office, but nobody will be there. None of the screens will be on. And it just looks like any other office. It doesn't, it's really the activities that are happening at the fusion centers that are of interest. And when in 2012, Congress, the Senate Homeland Security Committee did an investigation of fusion centers and found that, they were very wasteful with the funding, buying flat screen TVs. That was really, so I imagine a lot of them have flat screen TVs, and things like Bearcats, and, why does the fusion center have a Bearcat? Surveillance, technologies that the fusion centers aren't supposed to be doing surveillance, right? So it's kind of just created a slush fund that again, you mentioned the funding is so opaque, it's really hard to know what funding is going to the local police who work in the fusion center versus the fusion center itself. Is this system something? So it's, unfortunately, nobody has done the work. Even after that Senate investigation found that there were no cases where they could find terrorism was prevented through a fusion center. There was a lot of civil liberties violations and misuse of information, and a waste of resources. Congress never did anything with that report and just let it sit there.
It's wild. I think at the end of the day, like they also like that we have the ability to use that information, and it's a difficult thing. They don't like to give up their toys very easily, and until we make them, they're not going to.
Right, exactly. And if in the beginning in 2007, at when we were doing the report at the ACLU, one of the questions I got is, how come you're not calling to shut down fusion centers? And I explained, I don't care if there is a brick and mortar building where law enforcement shares information legitimately collected with other law enforcement agencies for legitimate purposes, right? That there are laws that govern the collection, the retention, and the dissemination, like there were when I was an FBI agent. And if they got rid of the brick and mortar fusion centers, but still had this network operating, it would be the exact same problem. So that's one thing that we have to understand about how the intelligence community thinks, and think about it as a spy satellite. If NSA had a spy satellite that was collecting a specific kind of information from some hostile country, and because of some malfunction, it stopped working, they would immediately start creating a new system to get that same information. Yeah. And, particularly when you have intelligence programs that are found to be problematic, where the public demands they're shut down, like total information awareness, they immediately break it up into other programs and disperse it in a way where they're going to continue getting that information in a more secretive way that the public doesn't find out about right away. It's going to take years before they find out about this new system that we have. Like, total information was shut down in about 2003, 2004. Ed Snowden highlighted how much it was still there.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So the real target is to go after the actions that are being taken, because like you say, the buildings aren't violating anyone's privacy. That's just where that's the location. But
who gets in, what information they're allowed to have, and who they're allowed to share it with.
I mean, they could literally do this through a Discord chat, and I mean, they don't need it to be in the building. So yeah,
right. I worked on getting Portland, Oregon City Council to take the police department out of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, San Francisco and Oakland as well. And one of the questions that skeptics ask me is, well, how if the police department isn't in the task force, can they get the information? And I would hold up my cell phone. We have ways to communicate. We were able to communicate before there were these centers. If there's information to be shared that's appropriate to be shared, fine. But if you create this center where who's in charge, what rules apply is all secret, that's not a system that fits in our democracy. And what I have found over and over again is it's not a system that's effective for security, right? That what ends up getting shared is information that doesn't really help protect anyone's security and actually puts us at risk, which the BlueLeaks revealed.
Yep. Makes sense. Let's see.
Well, you got my vote there, Mike.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that private companies sit inside there. What kind of industries are actually inside there?
It's hard to know. I don't really know. Back in 2006, it was, they tried very hard to protect that information. And the way that they express it in the guidance documents that came out of DHS and the Department of Justice was owners of protected industries. So, it was up to each local fusion center to decide who was invited in. But what has developed on top of, maybe, the heads of the power companies and the, other, what they called critical infrastructure. Maybe it was those groups, but later on, an industry developed of contractor analysts and contractor companies, data sharing and data analysis companies. And again, nobody's vetting these companies. Sometimes these companies are multinational companies. So what's their incentive in keeping Americans' data safe when they have interest in other countries? Right? We can use this information, and again, it's valuable. And in many ways, these fusion centers gathering all this information about all of us become one-stop shopping for cyber criminals, for hostile intelligence networks, right? They don't have to go out and collect reams of information about Americans. They can just go to the fusion centers. And what we found is the fusion centers are not very secure in how they handle data. And that problem is not being addressed by anyone. And, the federal government is hands off. This is them, not us. Even though FBI and DHS are in the fusion centers, even though it's FBI and DHS systems that provide information to and receive information from the fusion centers, it's astonishing that this kind of a network continues to exist with so little oversight and public knowledge about what they're doing.
Are you muted, Chris?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's why I didn't realize it'd be multinational companies in there too. It seems like a potential major national security threat in the place that's supposedly keeping us safe from national security threats.
Yeah, and again, I don't know who's in the fusion centers. So, but if you look at the companies that own what you might imagine would be described as critical infrastructure, and if you look at the companies that are involved in data accumulation and data brokering and data sharing and data analysis. A lot of those companies have interests in other countries, legitimate interests. Yeah, I'm not talking about, cyber criminals are a different issue, but just the fact that it's not clear whether the activities in the Fusion Center are designed to protect public safety as much as they are designed to protect the private interests of the participating companies. And that's part of a lawsuit that was brought in Oregon against the Titan Fusion Center, that the Intercept has done a lot of reporting about fusion centers. They reported that local anti-oil and gas pipeline development advocacy movement was spied on by the Fusion Center with the assistance of the private companies running the pipelines. And the same thing happened at the Standing Rock protests, where private companies have access to the information channels and direct input to the law enforcement agencies that are responding to the protests. So when you look at how volatile that protest policing is, okay, are they there to protect the public, or are they there to protect the interests of a private company?
Right.
And
That's
increasingly, I'd say a private company.
Yeah, that's why I'm gonna have to look into that more. I didn't know that about the protest, that one in Oregon. That's
the policing protest, or I'm sorry, the policing project out of NYU brought the lawsuit. So there's a lot of material on their website.
I'm definitely gonna dig into that one. That's wild. Yikes! I mean, it's the more I dig into this, the more it blows my mind. Like, you think you've finally wrapped your head around it and realize this is really bad, and then you read one more thing and you're like, no, how? Like, it just keeps getting worse. Like, it's insane.
And it was frustrating. We went to the Governors Association and said, you need to sort of understand what these centers are. The federal government is claiming these are state centers. The state needs to take some control of this. And they would say, we don't have any way of finding anything out about them. They won't talk to us. They won't give us information. We don't have the staff to do a deep investigation. We don't have access to do a deep investigation. So there's nothing we can do. Same with state legislators. We talk to them all the time, and they're handcuffed. How are we going to get information? I testified recently in California about an audit suit. And you would think at a hearing, somebody representing the fusion centers would be testifying in a legislative hearing, but they didn't even show up.
That's wild. That's really surprising.
Yeah. Because they know they don't want to be asked hard questions, particularly
it's indefensible. Like, there's so many questions you can ask that's just like, there's no good answer that they could possibly give that's going to get people on their side. So that's like what we say about Palantir too. Like, you don't see a lot of interviews with Palantir. I'm like, because how do you answer the questions anybody's going to ask them? Like, there's no good answer to them. So the best play is just don't ever be in a position to answer questions.
Right. Certainly not under oath.
Yeah, definitely not under oath. That one's a whole other level of danger. All right, well, I think we're going to take a quick little 3-minute break right here, and then we'll be back. We got a lot more stuff going on. We're going to dig in some more into the actual Fusion Center abuses and BlueLeaks and all that horrible stuff. Like I said, it just keeps getting worse. So we'll see you back in just a few minutes.
All right, T-minus 3 minutes. Digital freedom, yeah, that is our choice. Privacy doesn't mean not having a voice. What you wanna share is only your choice. Yeah. How you gonna tell me what I can and cannot say online? That's some fascist dystopian Orwellian mind crime. These bureaucratic acrobatics got me spastic and dramatic. They want access to your Spotify, your TikTok automatic. Every habit that you practice, want to catalog and stash it in a database. Is massive as some DHS tactics, but it's tragic. These fanatics want to track us like we're cattle. Build a dragnet apparatus like the internet's a battle. I'm empowered by encryption, got conviction in my diction. Prophecies about permission, but it's freedom that's the mission for a healthy, happy nation. Not a brave new world creation where they're tracing conversations, placing agents in your basement. Really, it's about permission, but they just want our submission. Privacy, protection, freedom, they're the perfect coalition. That's the freedom I define, that's the future, that's the peak. You can freely speak your mind if you're allowed to hide. T-minus 2 minutes. Design, they can't confirm. only your choice. Look, the world is a
T-minus 1 minute.
Everybody posting every place that they've been. Trading privacy for likes, that's a heavy cost. In the ocean of data, the person gets lost. So we flip the switch, yeah, we go underground. Moving through the silence without making a sound. Not hiding because you are doing something wrong. Just defending your rights before they are gone. The room is secure, so let the session start. Speak from the brain or speak from the heart. Tell us your story, we unlock the doors. We invite the guests and yeah, the floor is yours. You can keep the mask on,
T-minus 30 seconds.
Privacy expresses, but opinions are free. We amplify the voices that they try to call weak. Welcome to the stream, time to hide and speak. Hide and speak, stay in the shadows and make some noise. Hide and speak, hide and speak. Digital freedom, yeah, that is our choice. Hide and speak, hide and speak. Privacy
10,
doesn't mean not having
9,
a voice.
8,
Hide and
7,
speak, hide and speak.
6,
What you wanna
5,
share is only your
4,
choice.
3, 2, 1.
Hey, welcome back. We are here with Mike German, an American hero and ex-FBI agent turned whistleblower. And we're about to dig into some horrible abuses inside fusion centers that he has let us know about. So let's see. 2020 leak showed fusion centers in Minnesota, Maine, Texas, and California surveilling Black Lives Matters protesters. What surprised you most about what came out of those documents?
Very little surprised me. To the extent that one breach in one contractor exposed 269 gigabytes of data, I think certainly should have been shocking enough. Again, just if you're looking at this as a security issue, right? So my understanding of the leak, and we're fortunate because apparently the perpetrators were hacktivists, right? They weren't people stealing credit card information, although my understanding is that might be in the data. It was people who were trying to expose what the fusion centers were doing it. But one contractor had a security flaw that was exploited to get so much of the information going back years, I understand, like 10, 12 years, that the fusion centers had been sharing through their networks. So, if hacktivists were able to get that information, what do hostile foreign intelligence services from China and Russia, or, name your other country, have access to that never gets exposed? So those vulnerabilities are never corrected, right? That this fusion center network has become a huge vulnerability to American security, not just a threat to our civil liberties, but the data that was obtained showed that they were, doing what we've always seen domestic intelligence operatives do, is spy on protest movements, spy on political activists, spy on people who are protesting the police, right? There's a reason the FBI and other law enforcement agencies would be interested in what activists concerned about police policies are, right? But it's not for safety. It's because they're trying to protect their own equities and authorities. So, this type of spying is what is so dangerous to democracy, because our right to freedom of association, speech, and grievance is being impacted by this overt surveillance that is intended to put people in fear, to make them realize that, okay, if I go out and protest, I'm putting myself at risk and my career at risk. And I don't know, what the government's going to do with that information. And, nowadays they hold on to it. And it might be that, okay, we can't prove you've done anything wrong. There's nothing we can do immediately. But what happens when you become a whistleblower? I mean, that's what I found out, that, obviously I was an FBI agent and most of my information the FBI already had. But, it goes back to that saying, nobody's administratively pure. All of a sudden, to discredit me, they were doing investigation after investigation, trying to find some failure on my part to adhere to the law and policy, so that they could blame me for the problems rather than just taking the information I had and deciding whether that was accurate.
That's a common tactic. You go right after the person and discredit them and damage their, reputation, rather than when they know they can't actually disprove
Right.
what the person is saying, they just try to make people stop listening to them, basically. But
Yeah.
it's a horrible
So,
thing.
when the government has the ability to collect all that information about people who aren't doing anything wrong and aren't suspected, okay, maybe you're good later on, decide to run for Congress. Okay, the government has all this information, and if you're talking about changing government policy, maybe that'll come out, that'll leak somewhere, and so that easy access to such vast stores of domestic intelligence being collected about all of our activities, again, even when we're not doing anything wrong, could be used to embarrass us so that we don't seek public office. It could be used to harm us in some other ways. To look at COINTELPRO. That's what the FBI was doing, trying to break up marriages, trying to break up organizations using dirty tricks that J. Edgar Hoover had authorized. That kind of system still works.
Yep, absolutely. Like I'm never surprised anymore by how low they'll stoop to get the information they want. Like, and now that we live in an information age where there's an infinite amount more information available publicly, or at least connected to the internet now, than there used to be. And you're talking that the government has some of the best hackers in the world and some of the best systems in the world. They're the number one buyer of 0-day exploits, so that they buy them so that they can't be patched, so that they're the only ones that know about them. So they have the ability to get access to more information than anybody else, and that's a tremendous amount of power. And a lot of people, they fall back to the thing, well, that's fine, I have nothing to hide, I don't do anything wrong. And what you don't understand is that they could take a message out of context that you could be saying the greatest possible thing ever that everybody in the world would agree to, but taken out of context could make you look like a horrible, horrible person. And they're not going to put the context out. They're just going to post that one message. And now everybody, the public jury is going to look at you and be like, well, this person's terrible. Everything they say is wrong. I hate this guy. And you've done nothing wrong. So it doesn't matter if you're a great person that has done nothing wrong. Like, if they want to make you look bad, they can make you look bad when they have access to everything you've ever said and done. So
and that's the blackmail angle, right? Where it's like so now at the end of the day, all of this information is just being served up to somebody that works for the government. Like, we look at the government as this giant thing, but it's really just individuals working there. So there's going to be one person viewing a computer screen, and they're going to have access to all of this information, and they can do with it whatever they want, technically, because they're just a person manipulating the system, right?
Yeah. So, and when I was at the ACLU of Maryland represented some activists who would go down to the local NSA facility and stand at the gate and protest. Really very mild kind of stuff. But they found out that the Maryland State Police, in conjunction with the federal government and other agencies, were monitoring them, and they all had these dossiers that the state police had gathered, and the ACLU of Maryland was able to obtain them and expose that this surveillance operation was taking place. And I went up and testified and met some of the activists. And one of them was a woman who said, I was a Vietnam War protester, and I remember what J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was doing. So I wasn't the least bit surprised that I was being surveilled again, for my anti-war activities. She said, but I wasn't frightened by it because I didn't think I was doing anything wrong until I saw my file. And as soon as I saw my file, I realized they have so much inaccurate information in here that makes me look very different than I am. They have me at protests that I wasn't at. They have me saying things that I didn't say. They have all kinds of flawed information in here that paints a very different picture of my advocacy than very inaccurate depiction of my advocacy. So she said that scared me more than anything, and that's what I would argue to anybody who asked me that question. You know, if I'm not doing anything wrong, why would I worry about it? You know, there's no guarantee that the information they collect is going to be accurate, number one. And number two, if you're not doing anything wrong, why does the government want it? They want it. You know, that's really the question you should be asking yourself. Why does the government want, you know, a friend of mine asked me that question. I said, how much do your phone records, how much will analyzing your phone records tell the government about terrorism? She said, none at all. I said, then why does the government collect your phone records on a regular basis? And she said, I don't know. Why do they do that? I said, that's what you need to ask, because they're doing it for a purpose. We don't know what that purpose is, but, you know, we can guess that it's not to help us. You know, that's information that can be used against you, or used to manipulate you, or used to, you know, again, go back to COINTELPRO and look at what the government was doing, you know, get people fired from their jobs secretly, you know, that there wouldn't be the FBI's fingerprints on it, get people denied a promotion into a public office. You know, that kind of backdoor dealing could harm you without you ever knowing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you know, one of the FBI's tactics after 9/11 with war protesters, and we see this a lot with environmentalists as well, they'll go out and knock on doors in your neighborhood. Hi, I'm from the Joint Terrorism Task Force, here to talk about your neighbor. Hi, I'm from the Joint Terrorism Task Force. I just have a few questions about your tenant in your apartment building.
Wow.
Or your employee, right? Where, okay, now maybe your landlord is going to find a reason to get rid of you. Maybe your employer is going to say, you know, this is a risk I don't want to take. If the FBI Terrorism Task Force thinks you're potentially a subject of a terrorism investigation, I'm going to find a different employee. So it has all kinds of effects on us, and can be used and manipulated in ways that do great harm and chill participation in our democracy, right? Yeah, because you know the effect of it is people are less willing to go to a protest where nowadays you'll see the police with big cameras filming everybody who's there. You know, that, okay, I don't want my employer to know that I'm doing this. I don't want my neighbors to know that I'm doing this. I don't know what might happen with this. You know, what happens if the guy next to me who I don't know goes on to do something bad?
Well, and then that's kind of the problem, right? Because they can now control all of that data. So they can even manipulate that data, like you were saying. So they could fabricate something to say that you were here in this place.
Right. And they don't even have to fabricate it, right? Just the fact that, okay, you're at this protest with 10,000 other people, and 5 guys over there, you know, broke through rocks at police. You know, you're part of this violent movement that you know, we're now, you know, and we've seen that with the Trump counterterrorism policies, you know, naming, you know, anti-Americanism and anti-capitalism are the terrorists now.
Well, the new one today is anti-tech. Do you see that? Just today they announced a new one. Is if you're anti-tech, that's extremism now. Right.
So, you know, and kind of the way this counterterrorism narrative has taken over since 9/11, it is a big part of the problem, that, you know, labeling somebody a terrorist has an impact on your life, you know, and again, this was severely targeted the Muslim and Arab American populations right after 9/11, where a bunch of Muslim American charities were shut down. No evidence, no trial, you know, it just put out of business. Well, you know, that's not how it's supposed to work in a democracy run by the rule of law. That government should have to provide evidence in public tribunal that can be rebutted by those who are accused.
Yeah, for sure. Now, we're saying a lot of stuff that's sort of negative about the government. So we like to balance things out here as much as possible. So just real quick, we're going to just put on screen an exhaustive list of all of the terrorist attacks that the fusion centers have stopped so far. So just watch for a minute. Okay, so moving on to our next question here. This month, the Intercept reported on a Colorado Fusion Center bulletin warning that DHS's own ICE recruitment posts are so saturated with white supremacist imagery that they could incite vigilante violence, and that extremists were openly discussing infiltrating ICE to build a breakaway militia. You spent years undercover inside exactly those type of movements. When you read that bulletin, did it land as the system finally working or as something else?
It's fascinating. I'd love to know what the analyst who wrote that and the supervisor who approved it going out, probably over Department of Homeland Security channels, right? The Homeland Security Information Network is one of the primary portals for sharing information in the Fusion Center network. It's interesting. I mean, obviously, I have tremendous concerns about the Department of Homeland Security social media using white supremacist themes and memes and militia themes and memes. But for the Fusion Center to accurately report that as an issue and as a potential problem, I think highlights how this terrorism narrative is so disconnected from facts. And you know, certainly the way that the Trump administration during the first term opened their arms to good people in the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally, quote unquote, quote unquote good people, or fine people, I think was the term, to the embrace of the Proud Boys, to the pardon of the January 6th militants. There's a significant concern that it kind of, going back to our discussion of my time in the movement, you know, when people who are promoters of these ideologies and theologies and philosophies are out on the street with access to weapons and the willingness to use them against their fellow Americans, that presents a problem, a law enforcement problem that law enforcement doesn't do an effective enough job at addressing. But when they actually have the levers of government power, they can do far worse, and they can harm far more people. And you know, what I've always tried to highlight is that you know, when government is taking these actions, you know, we've created this term terrorism that doesn't apply to government violence, right? It's any definition, you'll see a non-government entity, where it's the government that are the professionals in inflicting violence and can inflict it at such a scale, and that's really the biggest danger. And when we have that kind of influence in law enforcement, in the Department of Homeland Security, as well as in Congress, in the executive branch, that's something that we really have to recognize as an existential problem for American democracy.
Absolutely. And I mean, it also sets the tone for the citizens. You know, a lot of people look up to, what does the government say? What are they doing? What are their actions? That's what we're supposed to follow. So if they're putting forth this idea that we should be hateful based on race, then people are going to follow that, and they're going to feel like they're protected. You know, the average racist is not going to go out and attack somebody for the color of their skin. They're just going to say nasty stuff in their house to their friends online and stuff like that. Right. But when they see the government doing it on the streets, they are now empowered to say, well, hey, it's cool now. We're allowed to do this. Let's go. They're going to high five us. We'll go get a beer with ice afterwards. You know what I mean? So it's like, it's sending a signal to people like, it's okay now. And it's not okay.
I'm so glad you said that, because the government uses this theory of radicalization, terrorist radicalization, that, you know, it's the people spreading ideas that are the problem. And they use that, even though that's a flawed narrative, it doesn't actually work that way. But it's a preferred theoretical framework for the government, because then they get to shut down oppositional political movements, right? If whatever violence was happening during the civil rights movement isn't the problem, it's Martin Luther King's speeches that are the problem, then we can use government power to suppress that kind of speech. And I've argued that that's not empirically sound. It isn't an accurate theory in how actual terrorists work. And I was criticized when I started complaining about government agents using this language, saying, oh, you're saying these government spokespeople are radicalizing. No, the government is the authority. They get to say what the law is. And if the government is saying it's okay to commit violence against these groups, then you're going to see an increase in that violence. You know, I know from working undercover in white supremacist groups, it was hard to convince people to commit violence against the various groups that they didn't like, because you have to become a fugitive, right? So they're real people too. They have families, they have hobbies, they have school or work requirements that they're trying to fulfill. So, you know, what was happening in those meetings is they were saying, okay, we have to do this thing. And the discussion was, well, you know, do we have to do it this month because I have this thing coming up, but I just had a baby. I just had, you know, that, you know, I can't go on the run today. But if the government is telling you, if law enforcement agencies are telling you this is okay, that's going to allow them to amass thousands of people, let's say, in front of the Capitol to prevent the certification of election. You know, that's what causes that type of violence, is when government authority, and particularly law enforcement, is saying we're okay with this level of violence or this level of activities targeting the disfavored groups.
I did. Information among people is terrorism, because I'm pretty sure that, you know, King George would have said the same thing about John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. You know what I mean? Like, that's the whole thing that our country was based on, is that we can talk to each other and share our ideas. So when we start going against that, like, what are we doing? We're losing the thread here.
Right. I think there's a John F. Kennedy quote. I don't have it in front of me, so it is probably butcher it, but it was something to the effect of, if you make peaceful change of government impossible, then you can expect violence.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense.
I like that.
Yeah, that's a good one. I haven't heard that one.
I'll have to find that, and I'm pretty sure it was John F. Kennedy.
He had a bunch of good ones.
Yeah.
Well, here's the irony I can't get past. You spent a career arguing that fusion centers overcollect and rarely catch real threats. The one that produces the generally sharp warning is about the government's own recruitment messages. Does that actually complicate your case about fusion centers, or does it sharpen it?
I think it sharpens it because it highlights the dysfunctional way these agencies are shoved together to work together. Right? That okay, does this fusion center, you know, does this fusion center really believe that DHS is doing something harmful to our society? Then why is it participating in the fusion center network? Right? That okay, maybe it's time to dismantle this network, and it's really the response, kind of like the opposite of the civil rights movement, where you had state governments violating civil rights and the federal government stepped in to protect civil rights. Here we have a system where the federal government is not just violating civil rights, but actually threatening our security. Maybe it's time for the state governments to be the bulwark against that, and to say, we can dismantle this network. If your agency is posing a threat to the government, why in the world should we continue to support your agency ability to get information about Colorado citizens?
Right.
And you know, the fascinating thing to me, this has become a part of the discussion since the lawlessness of the ICE raids across the country. And in Los Angeles, there are local laws that prevent law enforcement from working directly with ICE on immigration enforcement. But what they were seeing was LAPD was going out and suppressing the protests of the people protesting the ICE actions. And so it looks an awful lot like you're working together, right? Here's the guy with a badge doing something that we think is illegal that we want to protest. And here's another guy with a badge coming and hitting me on the head. When I say that, okay, you're on the same team. And the LAPD chief called to the carpet in front of the city council, said, well, it's our responsibility to answer a call for service from a fellow law enforcement agency. Where it's like, no, that's not part of your obligation. Your obligation is to protect the citizens of Los Angeles and protect their rights. And here you have a federal agency violating their rights. You actually have levers. And, there's a supremacy clause in the Constitution. So I agree with what he said, that they're not allowed to obstruct ICE. But guess what? Don't support them at fusion centers. Don't support them in joint terrorism task forces or joint drug task forces. Don't support them anywhere where they can get access to information you're collecting. Disconnect from the federal government in these law enforcement sharing portals, and you'll see federal law enforcement policy change overnight. Federal law enforcement is incredibly small compared to state and local law enforcement around the country. The FBI only has about 30,000 employees. Only about 12,000 of those are FBI agents, and they're spread all over the country, all around the world, right? They can't do their job unless they can leverage the state and local law enforcement, which is why they create these federal task forces. And the federal government invested in creating the fusion centers for this very purpose, that we don't have enough people to collect the massive information that we want to collect. So we're going to have to join with state and locals to get them to be they would even say this, our eyes and ears, and get them to report that information to us. So if the state government says we're not participating in these anymore, you'll see the federal government say, okay, what do we have to do to curb our behavior to make you want to remain in these programs? So they have a lot of leverage that unfortunately they're not using. Even in these so-called sanctuary cities and sanctuary states, they're not using that leverage at all. And too often, like in Los Angeles, certainly give the appearance of actually helping the federal agencies engage in this kind of misconduct.
Yeah, it doesn't really make sense. We're kind of hypocritical against what their own laws are.
Right.
Well, let's get to the really important part here is ending fusion center abuses, because that's what the real goal is here. You testified before the California committee in March, and they voted to audit 3 fusion centers a week later. What did you say in that hearing that you think actually moved the room?
I'm not sure anything I said in the hearing moved the room. One of the questions that I got from a legislator who seemed skeptical was, hey, we're involved in a conflict in the Middle East again, maybe this isn't time to, and I said, no, that's exactly the time. Don't you wish we would have started an audit of the counterterrorism policies of the FBI and the CIA in August of 2001, rather than having to find out on September 11th how dysfunctional they had become. That you want to know when the threat is high, that these agencies are functioning effectively and efficiently and focused on the right things. If they're out there collecting information about things that aren't security issues, that's resources that are being wasted. So,
yeah,
I think that played a role. Frankly, I think the Fusion Center leadership in California helped by not showing up. That it really revealed that, okay, wait a minute, these entities don't want to have to expose themselves to questions from our elected representatives.
It also goes to their whole, above the law attitude, where they feel that they don't have to answer for this kind of stuff, which is really one of the biggest problem in all this, is that having no good way for oversight and no good way to make meaningful change on how they're doing things is just it makes it very, very difficult to have anything happen. So I'm really excited about the audits. I'm really hoping that this is for real and they actually dig in and that it does something, because they still have that same challenge where who's in charge here and who can actually make the rules. So like, even if they audit it and they say, okay, all this is wrong, are they going to be able to do anything with that information? That's the next part of the fight here.
Well, and even if it just brings it to the public's, attention, right? It's just, even if it fails, it just brings it to the attention of everyday normal people.
Right. I think, any audit is a good audit, and, putting any independent eyes on this institution, or even attempting to, I think is a positive. And, even if they came out and said, we didn't see any misconduct, I think any kind of detailed report would raise more questions than provide answers. And I imagine that there will be, when we see the audit, it will have a tremendous number of caveats. And we saw this in Massachusetts, where the state auditor, I don't believe there was legislation there. I think the auditor just had the right to look at any state organization, decided to audit the Commonwealth Fusion Center, the Massachusetts State Fusion Center, and issued a report saying we weren't given access because we're a state entity, so we don't have access to the federal systems and federal information, and therefore we weren't able to evaluate any of the questions that we were trying to answer. And that's a likely result of this audit, because there is this opaque authority over who's in charge. That, okay, is this actually a state entity or is it a federal entity? And if it's a federal entity, then what are state employees doing there? And who controls their behavior? And are they following state and local laws? And I don't think, I think any audit that will review that will either find that there are problems or find that they're not allowed to look for the problems.
Which in itself is a problem. And
exactly.
And having that public is huge.
And I've been in the advocacy game longer now than I was a federal law enforcement officer. So, I know that legislators, particularly around law enforcement, and when they're throwing up counterterrorism as a way to scare them, they're afraid of tinkering with something that is designed, or at least arguably designed, to protect their constituents. They're timid, and they don't want to do something without some report that says this will be okay. So, getting them to approve an audit is one step. But once the audit either highlights the problems or highlights the lack of access, then it's really time for them to step up and say, okay, we can't continue this, particularly in a situation where the federal agencies are involved in such obvious political manipulation of investigative authority and targeting groups clearly out of retaliation rather than focusing on what actually protects the public.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. If a Fusion Center analyst is watching this and quietly agrees with you, what should they actually do tomorrow morning?
That's a hard question. I know that there are Fusion Center analysts and agents in the FBI and Department of Homeland Security and law enforcement officers across this land who are there to do the right thing and stay within the rules in their own conduct. But it really takes somebody coming forward with the truth. And, a lot of times that involves personal risk. But, go talk to your state representatives, go talk to your federal representatives, tell them what's actually happening. I find it interesting that the Colorado Fusion Center was able to get out a report that raised it publicly, but I would hope that they're talking with their state representatives and local representatives and talking with their federal representatives to say, hey, this is a real problem here, and we're concerned about what the federal government is doing. And likewise, whether it's the DHS social media or ICE activities, the state has, they're a sovereign as well, and they have authority to take action to protect their public.
And they should. I think that, it's their state. Like, the states need to really start standing up to the federal government more on not just this, but on a lot of things. We've sort of lost that, which is really one of the most important parts of like the structure of this country and making sure things are working right.
I don't want police in riot gear facing off with other police in riot gear, but literally all they have to do is decouple. Literally say, okay, we're out of all the joint fusion center, or we're out of the fusion centers, we're out of the joint task forces. We're not going to cooperate in this system as long as the federal agencies are engaged in this kind of misconduct in our state. And we're going to investigate that misconduct, and where it violates the law, bring charges. And, we're starting to see some of that in Minnesota. But, that has to take place on a much bigger scale. And I would argue that, DHS and the FBI and other federal agencies are 100% willing to throw an agent or two under the bus and let them get prosecuted. In order to force policy change, you need to take more drastic action, like decoupling from the task forces and fusion centers.
Yeah, I mean, there's a middle ground between like going to war with another agency and giving them an office with their name on the door. Like there's there's a step in the middle there that it could be taking, for sure. Probably many different steps. Absolutely. So let's see. We have some great questions here from our audience. Let's see what we got here. What are your thoughts on InfraGard and fusion centers' roles in organized stalking or gang stalking?
Those terms I don't really understand. I've heard them a lot and don't really have a lot of understanding about what they refer to. I mean, obviously, I'm very concerned about fusion centers and law enforcement engaged in all kinds of surveillance misconduct. But I don't know. Those terms are somewhat of a mystery to me, so I can't comment directly.
Yeah, fair enough. Let's see what we got here. Do you have any specific stories when you were undercover that you'll never forget?
Certainly, lots of them. I tend not to talk. I don't really discuss those things publicly, and part of it is because there are real people involved, and I'm 100% sure that everybody who went to jail on those cases is out, and I hope has rebuilt their lives in a way that they can be a positive influence in their community. And I don't think telling those stories helps anything.
For sure.
I did my job. They paid their debt to society. That's it. That's raising this again years and decades later, I don't think is appropriate. So I tend not to tell those stories in public.
Fair enough. In the end of Imperium, there was a scene where the main actor went back to a classroom where there was one of the guys that was in one of the white supremacist groups he'd infiltrated, and he was out now, and he grew his hair out, and which, by the way, I want to say this is powered by genetics, not by hate, just to be clear. But he was there to see him in school, and he was actually speaking to students and telling them about how he had been hateful and why, and how he felt that it was wrong, and how he's trying to do better. And it was really neat seeing that the agent still connecting with him and trying to see, help him get back on a better path in life. Did you ever do that with anybody? Was there anybody you kept in contact with after the fact?
No, that certainly I didn't think it was appropriate to stay in contact with anyone. The whole relationship is so fraught, that I don't think that would have been a good idea. There was one of the prosecutors involved in the LA skinhead cases, actually, and then this is where Dan Ragussis got the idea. He had a program he called Operation Grow Hair, where he was trying to get the younger people who were involved in the skinhead movement to meet with Holocaust survivors and others to try to change their way of thinking. And I don't know how successful it was. I don't believe, maybe it did. I'm not really sure whether it involved the people who are actually charged with crimes versus young people who just happen to be part of the gang, but not involved in the criminal activities. That's where it came out of, but I didn't have any personal involvement in that. I think you're
there. It is again. Yeah. Are you familiar with NSA whistleblower Karen Melton Stewart and her work to expose Fusion Center abuses?
Actually, I'm not.
I haven't heard that one either. I'm going to have to look that up.
Yeah,
for sure. But I welcome it. The more the merrier. Like, let's get this information out there for sure.
Yeah. And there are some groups that have been doing it on both sides of the political spectrum over the last 25 years, trying to raise awareness of the threat fusion centers pose to our democracy. So there are certainly many others involved in these efforts in the California legislature. The Maine legislature passed an audit bill, but then it ended up not getting funded. They actually had a bill that would have shut down the Maine Fusion Center, but that didn't pass. So, there are efforts around the country to address this problem. And, if somebody wants to work with me, I'm not that hard to find.
Awesome. That's good to know. So we do a little fun thing which is how we met Mike. Mike was a hero of the week on our show, and we've got one this week, a very special one. So I'm just going to run this real quick.
We look for the champions leading the way. Go fight for your internet rights every day. It's freedom and justice that we truly seek. We salute the hide and speak hero of the week.
This week's Hide and Speak Hero of the Week was picked by our guest and former Hero of the Week, Mike German. His pick, Terry Albury. Albury spent 17 years at the FBI. He was the only black agent in the Minneapolis field office, the son of an Ethiopian refugee, and he was assigned to surveil Muslim and immigrant communities. But what he saw on the inside, he couldn't keep quiet. In 2017, he leaked the FBI's classified internal rulebooks to the Intercept. The series that followed, titled The FBI's Secret Rules, showed America who the Bureau can spy on and how. The answer? Pretty much anyone. Based on a vague tip, agents could pull travel records, run names through the CIA and NSA, and demand your browsing history through national security letters that never see a judge, journalists included. For that, Albury was prosecuted under the Espionage Act during Trump's first term and served 4 years in federal prison. When asked about it, Terry simply said, "I was never ashamed." Terry Albury, thank you for standing up for our rights, even at great personal cost. For that, you are the Hide and Speak Hero of the Week.
Hide and speak hero of the week.
Very cool. And thank you, Mike, for pointing that one out. I was not familiar with that case. I've read all about it the last few days, and absolutely really cool. I've spent so many hours reading through all those Intercept articles. I'm not sure how I missed those in the first place, but
yeah,
definitely really, really cool stuff there.
Yeah. And I have just such great respect for Terry because he was far braver than I was. That, he was willing to risk prison to tell the truth. Yeah. And I was very careful not to reveal anything I wasn't allowed to talk about because I was afraid of going to jail and didn't think that would be something that would drive reform at that time, shortly after 9/11.
That's very humble of you, Mike.
Well, it's not, I mean, people forget what the period after 9/11 was like, where, the Bush administration said, you're either with us or you're against us. And if you're against us, you're with the terrorists.
Yeah.
So
Different time for sure.
That's right.
yeah, so it was a different time, and the secrecy that had built up in protecting the FBI had gotten so bad that literally one of the things Terry was alleged to have released, I don't what the government has charged was the FBI's internal rule book. Right? How is it we have a public agency we pay for with our tax dollars, and we don't understand what rules they operate under?
Why is it a crime for us to see that?
Right, exactly. So, it was critical for that information to get out so that we could understand what the FBI is doing, how they interpret their rules. And Terry was willing to pay a significant price for it. And I know Terry personally, and I know that price was very heavy for him and his family. And so I have just tremendous respect for him.
I imagine so. I mean, to lose 4 years of your life for doing what any good American should do, like what he did, there's nothing wrong with what he did. Like not doing it is more wrong than doing it. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
you take an oath as an FBI agent that you're there to defend this nation, and that is exactly what he did. And he still did it knowing full well that even though that is the right thing to do, that it was going to take part of his life away from him in a very meaningful way, and take him away from his family too. And that's a huge commitment to make and a huge sacrifice to make. And we really appreciate that. Right. But I don't want to downplay like your sacrifice either. I mean, you 16 years, you had a amazing career going, and you were willing to give that up. And not a lot of people are willing to do that. And a lot of people, as far as they go is a snarky tweet. And that's it. That's as far as they're going to go to make any difference. They're going to post a nasty social media comment, and then they're going to go back to their normal life, and that's it. And fair enough, I get it. Different people are willing to go different lengths, but you were willing to give up a career. And honestly, like the 2 years that you spent, still, I didn't realize that you spent 2 years there after the fact. That to me, those 2 years might have been worse than giving up the career. That must have been a horrible situation.
It was quite trying, and particularly I'd grown up wanting to be an FBI agent and really had faith in the institution, and to lose that faith was a hard thing for sure. But I put Terry and Edward Snowden and those guys in a different category. I think the risks they took, and part of the problem with following the rules was I wasn't allowed to tell the whole story. And without the whole story, it's really hard to generate that public anger that drives reform. So, the Terry Alburys of the world, the Edward Snowdens, there are certainly others. I think I just have tremendous respect that they have that kind of courage and are willing to take that kind of risk.
Yeah, I think when there's a legal element to it, it adds another layer to it. Because, I mean, if you go tell your company's secrets to somebody, you can get fired. That's not a big deal. That's just a normal part of everyday life. People know that. But if you go tell your company's secrets, like, oh, this is how we make our bagels extra good, you're probably not going to prison for it. You know what I mean? Right. When there's like, this guy told us something that our government is doing, and they wanted so badly to keep that a secret, they're going to throw him into prison. Well, that makes me go, okay, this is important. What is it? Why? What did he say there? Like, we have to know what he's saying because they really don't want us to know that. So, I mean, I think it certainly adds that other layer to it.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, before we let you go, I want to thank you again for coming on Hide and Speak, and thank you for the last 20 plus years of telling the truth about this stuff when it costs you a career to do it. And thank you for your time as an FBI agent infiltrating vile white supremacist and extremist groups. The reason any of us can talk about fusion centers, about FBI overreach, and about how the surveillance state actually works is because people like you went and looked and then came back and said so out loud. You are truly an American hero, and we are really grateful.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate it.
We appreciate you. If you guys want more of this, Mike's book, Disrupt, Discredit, and Divide, the long version of tonight's argument, how the FBI traded the investigation for surveillance after 9/11 and what got broken in the process. Mike, where else do you want people to go look for your work?
At the New Press, and the New Press is a nonprofit Press. That's where Disrupt, Discredit, and Divide was published, and also Policing White Supremacy with Beth Zasloff. But they're a nonprofit that puts out good books, so support them as well.
Very good. And Nathan, as always, thank you for being here and for helping make Hide and Speak great.
Yeah, I'm a bit astonished. Thank you very much, Mike. I hope that we can bring you back on at some point in the future. And this was just amazing to learn all of this stuff. And your story is, fascinating. And all I loved your points of you're reaching out to Terry or to point out Terry's other, what's the word for it? But thanks for coming in.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. And I think my story is less important than you staying on this beat with the fusion centers and the intelligence surveillance abuses that are taking place. I really appreciate your work there.
Yeah, thank you. And we can't wait for your next book.
Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, honestly, we wouldn't know that we need to talk about the stuff if it weren't for people like you. So, I mean, it's a team effort here. We all got to work together on this thing. And, that's what we were saying earlier, like until we put the pressure on the government, nothing gets done. So
right.
We just want to let as many people know what's going on as possible so we can start putting that pressure on. So let's see, next week, we actually have a very interesting guest on, a guy named Frank Ahern, who has spent years finding people as a skip tracer and then switched over to helping people disappear. So he has some really interesting perspectives on what it takes to maintain privacy in the modern age. That is next Saturday, same time, same place. And that is our show for the week. So one thing that I want you all to think about is that the one time a fusion center produced a genuinely sharp warning this year. It was about our government's own recruitment posters. Make of that what you will. If tonight got you thinking, please share it with someone in your life who still says, I've got nothing to hide. We will see you next time. And until then, trust nothing, verify everything, and always stay in.
vp.net, the only VPN that can't spy on you. Your browsing data says more about you than you think. From marketing companies to hackers, everyone wants it because it's worth everything. And they'll stop at nothing to spy on you. Your searches and the sites you visit, that's enough to paint a picture. Most VPNs claim to protect your privacy, but here's the problem. You can't actually verify what they're doing behind the scenes. That's where vp.net is different. We're the only VPN built with Intel's SGX technology, the same trusted security used in banking, healthcare, and even the automotive industry. Here's the key. vp.net runs inside a secure black box, a protected environment so locked down that even we can't see inside it. That means no one, not even vp.net itself, can spy on your activity when you connect. You can verify in real time that your VPN is doing exactly what it promises, protecting you and nothing else. vp.net means no hidden tracking, no broken promises, just real provable privacy. vp.net, the only VPN you don't have to trust, because you can verify.